One of the most prominent species of the Star Wars galaxy was introduced with the line, "Many Bothans died to bring us this information." But despite this heroic sacrifice, the legacy of Bothans in the Legends expanded universe is a mixed bag. The first major in-story appearance of a Bothan character came with the Thrawn trilogy and the introduction of Traest KRe'fey, a politician largely working off the reputation of the Bothans for their information gathering during the rebellion. The success in finding the second Death Star's location was used by KRe'fey to gain a seat on the New Republic's Inner Council, despite a long-standing rivalry between KRe'fey and Admiral Ackbar. Heir to the Empire basically sets up Borsk as the embodiment of self-interested politicians working the political system of the New Republic to their own advantage, and he's for all intents and purposes an antagonist in the Thrawn trilogy, unknowingly used by Thrawn to put the best military mind of the Republic, Ackbar, out of commission. Our buddy Borsk not only continues to be used in this kind of oppositional role for most of the rest of the 90s, he basically sets the template for what a Bothan is, which is annoyingly common practice for defining sci-fi species. Corellians are great pilots because Han is, and Bothans just kind of suck because Borsk does. This, as you may be able to imagine, can be a problem when characters in a fictional universe are used to at least obliquely reference real-world debates. In the X-Wing novels, primarily set before the Thrawn trilogy for what we're going to be talking about, although released afterwards, the Bothans we see largely get portrayed as these political climbers like Borsk. The biggest example is Traest KRe'fey, a New Republic general whose position was gained less by strategic or tactical skill, and more because he was a political appointment by Borsk. He's pretty incompetent, and he's in charge of the Battle of Borlaus, which was meant to be a staging ground to take Coruscant, and he was hoping a success there would basically allow him to be in Admiral Ackbar's position. The book basically shows KRe'fey as making every possible mistake at Borlaus and then dying in the attack. He's shown to be a problem for the heroes in all the same ways as Borsk is in the Thrawn trilogy, except without any of the competence that Borsk tends to show in achieving his goals. With all of this going on, Bothans still tend to be the main species to bring up the poor treatment of aliens under the Empire especially, but because of the source, when it's Borsk especially, it kind of acts to poison the well on that topic, and anything they say in that vein is portrayed as unfairly playing the victim or manipulating other non-humans. So for a long time, it's clearly not meant to be a topic that's worth serious consideration when books do mention it. Eventually we get to Timothy Zahn's Hand of Thrawn duology, where the Bothans as a whole basically become galactic villains when their role in the destruction of the planet Kamas is revealed. Characters like Han and Leia actually show Traest KRe'fey some sympathy in this, with how he and every other Bothan is being collectively blamed for the actions of some of the Bothans. But at the same time, the story is still highlighting that the Bothans are being obstructionist and hiding information about the situation rather than helping to solve it. So while Borsk does get a bit of deeper characterization, he's still generally a jerk in it, and all of the things that are portrayed as negative traits for every single Bothan in prior books gets pretty much continued here. However, if we jump back a bit, while Wedge is forming Rogue Squadron in the X-Wing books, we do have two other Bothan characters, one of whom is a counterexample to all of this. First, we have Traest KRe'fey. Traest doesn't fit into the mold of Bothan characters, but it's partially because he's barely a character. The most he's discussed is when Wedge is frustrated at having to include him in the squadron because the Bothans feel they should get some representation. Then Traest gets relieved when he's not labeled as the worst pilot in the squadron over Gavin Darklighter and Lujani Forge, and finally, his fighter gets shot and he dies. So really, his biggest contribution is still used to highlight how the Bothan situation is going politically within the New Republic. But as the X-Wing books continue, his death opens up space for Asir Salar to join. She both acts as a counterexample to how Borsk and Laren act, while her broader storyline heavily reinforces that it's not just those two, that's just how Bothans are. She begins a romantic relationship with Gavin, which is frowned upon by the rest of the Bothans around her, who basically see her as a poster child for Bothawi, so her being with a human ruins their PR plans for her. Ultimately, Asir leaves the squadron having been presumed dead, but in reality she had returned to Bothawi to act as a military instructor, hoping to mold younger Bothan military minds away from this kind of thinking shown by Borsk and Laren. With the next indirect mention of her, her plans seem to be going in the right direction, though it doesn't come until the end of the 90s with the New Jedi Order series, set around 20 years later in-universe. A new Bothan character, Traest KRe'fey, grandson of Laren, claims to have been trained under a different way of thinking about Bothan society and how they need to exist within the galaxy. This is implied, though not confirmed, to be Asir. With Borsk still being an obstructionist, holding the New Republic back from a proper response to the Yuuzhan Vong invasion, Traest is introduced as the leading figure within the New Republic military willing to work with the protagonists and defy orders to do so in typical Star Wars fashion. Throughout most of the war, he's portrayed as a pretty competent leader and sympathetic figure. Even Borsk gets a redemption in the fall of Coruscant, where he sacrifices himself, blowing up the Senate to take out a considerable number of the invaders. Borsk's redemption and KRe'fey as a character basically act as a symbol of Bothan involvement in a growing group of characters willing to take action for the good of billions if not trillions of refugees being killed by the Yuuzhan Vong, rather than just continuing the trend of showing Bothans taking advantage of military crises elsewhere to gain political standing for themselves internally. Unfortunately, this redemption ends up stumbling a bit. In Destiny's Way, a book set in the late stages of the war, KRe'fey proudly announces to Jaina Solo, the daughter of Han and Leia, that he's basically convinced the Bothans to do a cheeky bit of genocide. During his visit home for Borsk's funeral, KRe'fey had convinced the rest of the Bothans to elevate the status of the war against the Yuuzhan Vong, invoking the Bothan KRe'fey, which requires all Bothans to enter a state of total war until the last enemy is killed, something they hadn't done for a long time. This basically causes the Jedi under his command to start making contingency plans to work against him if his orders in battle went too far, and this turned KRe'fey from a Bothan working in a position of power to cooperate with the other protagonists into another potentially antagonistic force in a way that I don't think was entirely necessary. And I think this is important thematically because it's not just someone taking the steps they need to win the war, it was coming at a time when the storyline was pretty heavily focusing not just on the war as a military venture, but where we had already started to see that not all of the Yuuzhan Vong were necessarily on board with what was happening, or how they were treated in their own society. So an outright assertion that they would be pursued to extinction, even after they lost the war, wasn't really something the reader was supposed to take in a positive light. Some of the following books basically pretended that this position was not held by KRe'fey in the first place, which I think kinda makes more sense for the character, but it does get a bit tricky. You can maybe reconcile that as him wanting the resources of an KRe'fey, and assuming once a surrender happened that they wouldn't want to pursue it further. In the finale of the series, The Unifying Force, after the death of Yuuzhan Vong's Supreme Overlord Shimra, KRe'fey is responsible for trying to negotiate a surrender with Yuuzhan Vong, and even expresses concern over his ability to convince other commanders under him, not just Bothans but in the whole Galactic Alliance military, to not continue pursuing Yuuzhan Vong ships or members of the Yuuzhan Vong species in general. The conversation between KRe'fey and Chief of State Cal Omas even highlights the thematic importance within the series that the Galactic Alliance wouldn't kill them all, and it would be ridiculous that the Yuuzhan Vong thought they might, despite what the Bothans had already said about the KRe'fey. KRe'fey does float the idea, when it comes to solving outstanding Yuuzhan Vong problems if they don't all surrender, that they do have the option to wipe out the rest of the species with the failed bioweapon Alpha Red. But following negotiations with War Master Nash Choka, and promises given by Nash Choka to cooperate with the Galactic Alliance directly to eliminate any Yuuzhan Vong warbands who refuse the surrender order, KRe'fey seems entirely on board with the idea that the war is over and they need to look towards coexisting now. KRe'fey's role as the liberator of Coruscant resulted in his promotion to the post of Supreme Commander, a position coveted for the Bothans since Borsk's earlier rivalry with Akbar, and his grandfather Laren's overreach at Borleus. And unlike those two, he achieved it through cooperating with basically everyone in the galaxy he could, including the Yuuzhan Vong at the end of the day. So the ending of the series is kind of at odds with the idea that he would be expected to continue on the exterminationist warpath. By the next book trilogy, Dark Nest, his predecessor Cien Sov is back in charge and KRe'fey had retired to Bothawi. He's just not mentioned in those books. The Bothans have gone back to being a somewhat antagonistic force once again in this trilogy. Basically, the first page of the Dark Nest trilogy mentions the Bothans targeting the Yuuzhan Vong on their new living planet, Zonama Sikot. Wikipedia attributes KRe'fey's resignation to the Bothan Arcry continuing, but it's unsourced on the site, and I haven't been able to find any source that directly makes that attribution. It just says that he's retired. In the next nearly 30 books, KRe'fey's name comes up once, and it's in a passing reference in a list of admirals. There is another Bothan present within the Galactic Alliance military who doesn't act upon these genocidal orders, Nek Buatsu, which seems to imply that KRe'fey could have continued as well. Nek unfortunately starts off kind of fitting the classic Bothan mold. He's the leader of forces acting in opposition to what the main characters are doing at the start. Though not necessarily in the same selfish way that Borsk was before, he's just acting as a representative of the Galactic Alliance, but he's still a Bothan semi-antagonist. The Bothan outcry does get walked back a little bit into being a specific Bothan political party that's advocating for it, the True Victory Party, but they take a pretty big portion of Bothan focus until the end of the Legends Expanded Universe. Nek ends up filling more of the KRe'fey role following his initial antagonism and a complete embarrassment when he falls for a gifted statue of himself filled with Killix and loses his flagship as a result. All in all, we do start moving back in the directions of Bothan being more than one type of character in Legacy of the Force, but the outcry situation with KRe'fey and then sidelining him really didn't help move that forward, all of which I think is kind of unfortunate.